What's up everybody? In this video I'm going to show you how to remove the axle. So first let's set the parking brake, let's chuck the rear wheels, jack up the car, set it on jack stands, remove those lug nuts and remove the wheel. Before you can loosen the axle bolt, you have to undo the indentation at the edge of the bolt. You can tap it out with a hammer and a cold chisel or a hammer and a punch pin. So now we're ready to loosen the axle bolt. And of course, it's easier to use an impact wrench. But if you don't have one, you can use a breaker bar and insert a pin into the brake caliper. Next, you need to disconnect the sway bar end link. If you have the OEM end links, then you will have to use a hex wrench and combination wrench to remove it. Next, let's work on the damper fork. This is a 17mm bolt. I used a combination wrench on one end and the impact on the other side. If you're lucky, the bolt actually spins out. If the bolt gets stuck, you can just use the punch pin to push it out with a hammer. Now you can remove the 14mm bolt at the top of this damper fork. I like to remove the damper fork because it gives me more room to work with, but it's a bit of a brain puzzle to do this. It takes some wiggling, some movement, and to help, you should be able to press down on the top of the rotor. Be persistent. With the damper fork out of the way, you will know if your axle is stuck in the hub, and if it is, you can tap the outer side with the threads with a hammer. Just do not damage those threads. So either use a rubber mallet or a hammer with a piece of wood dampening the blow. Now you need to disconnect the lower ball joint. My ball joint did not have a cotter pin, but if yours does, just put a new one when you put everything back together. If your ball joint spins when you are removing the nut, put the floor jack on the lower control arm and jack up the suspension a bit. This will keep the ball joint from spinning as you remove the nut. Now I'm going to use a ball joint separator to pull the lower ball joint from the lower control arm. Some people just grab a large hammer and hit the lower control arm to separate the ball joint from it. Do as you wish. I struggled a little bit using the ball joint separator, but I still prefer this method. Now I lift the whole knuckle and move it to the side to give me some room so I can pull out the axle. And then I set the lower ball joint back into place because I don't want the knuckle to hang. Now we're ready to separate the axle from the intermediate shaft. Use a punch pin and a sledgehammer to do this. If it is not coming loose, rotate the axle so you hit all sides around the cup side of the axle joint. Don't give up, be persistent. The driver's side axle is easier to separate from the transmission. All you need is a pry bar. When you're putting everything back together, I recommend to put some grease on the splines of the axle, and that includes the splines on the intermediate shaft. This will help to make the removal easier should you have to go back and remove the axle. When you are putting the axle back, wiggle it onto the intermediate shaft and you can press it using the palms of your hand. Give it a good thrust. If you want, you can hammer on the outside end of the axle to ensure that it's snapped in snugly. It may look like it's not all the way in, so I recommend taking a photo of the axle where it meets the intermediate shaft so you can see what that joint is going to look like when everything is put in securely. When putting the lower ball joint back into place, make sure not to damage the threads. If you need to lift that lower control arm up to tighten up the bolt on the lower ball joint, go ahead and do so. And before you tighten the bolts on the lower damper fork, lift the lower control arm with your floor jack before you torque it to specs.